So we now get to the stage when I'd encourage you to make a comment or ask a question. The process for doing this, there is a microphone. Please wait until it reaches you, because then our online audience can enjoy your questions or comments. Can I ask you to introduce yourself, or at least say who you are? And if you represent or work for an institution, it's always interesting for us to know about that as well. I'm going to take 2 or 3 comments and thoughts at a time, and then allow the panel to respond to them. While you're just gathering your thoughts briefly, and I can see a couple of hands already, can I just ask a question, Joe, of you? Is this the Asia Development Bank issuing an early warning? The impression I'm getting is that this isn't such a big deal in Asia as it is in other parts of the world, but you're detecting early signs of it. So is this a kind of an early warning that this report is issuing on inequality?
Well, I guess I wouldn't have so much hubris as to say that ADB is issuing an early warning, because in fact, you know, policymakers have been already developing this into their plans. I think what we've tried to do is to point out that it's really not just the problems that we're seeing in the developed countries, you know, the so-called 99%. But rather that within Asia, it's a problem that's widespread. It is something that the pursuit of growth itself has not been sufficient to deal with these other pressures that are coming in. So to make sure that this becomes a more prominent part of the policy dialogue.
Very good, thank you. So if we could now ask for some questions or comments from the room. I've got a lady here, please. I've got lots of hands, but can we start? This lady in the front first, thank you.
You said inequality.
Sorry, you have to introduce yourself and any
Okay,
institution.
Women for Justice and Peace.
Yes.
In Sri Lanka. You said inequality weakens governance. Isn't it the other way about? It is very much the case in Sri Lanka. Intentional policies has widened, and in fact, hardworking people have been reduced to begging people in 50 years, 60 years.
Very good. So I'll ask for 2 or 3 questions or comments, so scribble them down this end. Lots of hands. Can I have one here and then one here, please?
I'm a graduate from Cambridge University's Development Studies program last year, and I'm working here in London. And
my question is?
Yuan. And my question is mainly about what Dr. Dirk has just mentioned about the poor benefits from education. Because my feeling is that it's not only the case within Asia. I think it's a global phenomenon that more and more industry has been shifted to the finance sector instead of the actual industries, be it in the United States, or if we look at the United Kingdom here, also a large part of the GDP is composed of the service industries. And this has given me it's the same in China. Most of my graduates who graduate from the top universities in China all go to the banking sector, whether they studied like law, they studied engineering, they study economics back in the university. They all squeeze into the investment banking sector. That is what is happening now in China. And my feeling is that as these people, as the finance industry is expanding, the actual industries are actually being squeezed, and more profits, more and more value in the whole economic system is going to the finance sector. And if the actual industries cannot expand properly, then I don't think there will be many employment opportunities for the poor people. Actually, the factor in China is that the manufacturing sector in China is, for example, the household appliances. They are laying off people in China and all across the world. It has something to do with the Euro crisis, I think. But on the other hand, I think it's the global phenomenon.
Very good. I'm going to stop you there. Thank you. You could pass the microphone back to this gentleman here, and then we'll do a couple more afterwards. 1 and then 2. Yes.
Thanks. I'm Hugh Wimborne-Smith. I'm an independent researcher. My interest is in urbanisation, which has been touched on in a couple of the presentations. But I'd like to press the panel a bit on that. On the one hand, urbanisation promotes growth. Urban incomes tend to be higher. On the other hand, it seems to promote inequality in the urban urban-rural difference widens, and apparently in the urban area itself you get rising inequality. So how do you, what are the policy implications, particularly? Most people, or the World Bank sees promoting growth through urbanisation as being on the whole a good thing, but it seems to have a side effect which you are beginning to comment on.
Very good, thank you. If you pass it straight over your shoulder to that gentleman there.
Thanks very much.
Daniel Harris, Overseas Development Institute. I just want to come back for just a second to something that Dirk mentioned almost offhand, which is this notion of green growth. And clearly this is something we're starting to hear more about in a number of different countries, and there is substantial variation in how far different countries are along this sort of road to green growth in terms of policy making and policy implementation. But I would welcome the reflections of the panel on the implications of a green growth agenda for inequality and poverty reduction.
Thank you. And then the lady at the back, and then we'll ask our panelists to respond.
Nandini Dasgupta from the University of Greenwich. I quite liked your analysis of and the reasons for why we need to go for sort of less skilled jobs to reduce inequality. But where I see a fundamental problem is in Korea, we've, as the second speaker said, the investment was more on commercial loans rather than FDI, if I am not mistaken in my understanding, which means that the government had more control over how they can invest that money and how the industrial process proceeds. Whereas if you are dependent on FDI, the governments would have less say in how to make industry or manufacturing or whichever sector sort of more labor intensive rather than more technology based. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. So 5 quite distinct questions there. Joe, do you want to have a go at, we'll work our way down the panel this way. So, okay. But I'm going to make sure between you answer them all. So.
Okay, sure. I think let me start in the middle. The question on urbanization promoting inequality. I mean, this is in many ways sort of what Simon Kuznets saw when he was thinking about the Kuznets curve, was that you would essentially start by pulling people out of agriculture into higher the higher productivity manufacturing, which would essentially lead to a certain amount of inequality. And I think that's still a valid observation, particularly if we look at China. But that process itself should eventually lead to a turnaround in the inequality, as essentially you've got more people coming in and raising the rates. So I'm not sure how to place that in the overall debate. I see that as kind of one of the underlying drivers, but rather, so when we were thinking about the policy responses of trying to find ways to make sure that those links between the poorer areas, that they don't get left behind at the same rate, to make sure that you do have the building of skills for people in the lagging regions, and also the infrastructure links as well, so that they can take advantage of that change. The more government control on how aid is spent versus FDI. I guess in a way, yes, but also, I mean, keep in mind that a lot of the Korean aid, in particular, in the early years, was very much tied aid. So purchasing the goods, especially from the U.S., PL 480 loans or the grain subsidies, and a huge amount, of course, of it was military assistance, and so much of this was only, I guess, nominally under the government control, in as much as that was in line with government targets as well. Whereas with FDI, I suppose you don't necessarily have much say over what industry might be set up. But on the other hand, if you are not really sure which industries that might give you the best growth, in advance, it's not clear that there would necessarily be that benefit from having the governments deciding. I think somewhere in there is a sense of trying to make sure that you've got a level playing field, but then thinking about what are we receiving, monitoring that, and saying, okay, why is it that we seem to be having too much coming in capital? And that does tend to be that if you look at the incentives in some of these export regions, they do tend to be highlighting the capital regions, because that's what's likely to be exported. So I think there's a role for maybe reflecting on incentives and how that is bringing in the FDI. I guess just before I turn it over, I'd like to think about this question on the institutions leading to the inequality versus the inequality undermining institutions. I think that's a very, very valid point, that it's not really a one-way relationship, and I think that particularly the case where you've argued of Sri Lanka, that if the institutions are such that the institutions themselves are favoring, say, one class over another, that essentially we've got at the very beginning a breakdown of the process that would lead to more inequality. So some of it comes back to what our starting point was, which was Asia already being relatively fair, relatively equitable, and that equity now starting to dissipate to some extent. So some of it was that was our starting point, and so that tended to drive our arguments a bit. But that I think you make a very clear case for also thinking about how poor institutions might in fact undermine inequality in the first place. And that may very well get us to why Latin America during the 60s and 70s was moving in the other direction, and how its institutions are now changing after all this time to lead to more equity.
Very good. Dirk, any quick thoughts?
Yes, I mean, two, I think. One is on sort of this idea about FDI versus loans, commercial loans. I think that, of course, it's true that Korea didn't receive a lot of FDI as a percent of GDP up until the mid-90s, 97 and so on. Other Asian countries did. The question, I think, is about some countries can use FDI to be both a source of innovation and employment creation, whilst other countries can't. And I think then the issue is, how do you do that? I mean, at the moment we're doing a background paper for the World Development Report, which is asking that question about structural transformation and employment generation, which is thinking about these issues of how can you use FDI. And I think there are some interesting examples in the Asian context that export processing zones have been used to upgrade, and there are linkages being built in some of the countries between zones and the local population. Not in all countries, but in some, and of course Singapore is always an interesting story there. But other countries can't, and I think the issue then is how can this be done, and that is something that we need to learn more on. But the potential is there. So the potential is there for FDI to contribute to both growth, productivity change, innovation, and help employment growth at the same time. The other is one about structures and sectoral allocations, which I think is also an interesting question. Again, it is depends on stage of and level of development at which the country is at. I mean, some countries are at states that they need to go into services and high productivity services, and there is not a big problem that people are going into service. In fact, they need to go into service, and the problem very, very often is that the education system is such that they're lagging behind, and it's not producing the graduates to go into the new services sectors, which is creating this huge wage premium for these investment bankers and so on. But in other cases, of course, countries are at different stages. And if you take the case of Cambodia, their light manufacturing is still seen to be more at the top end, almost, isn't it? So the garment assembly is always said, well, it creates huge jobs, and you've got an interesting factor in there, I think, in the report, multiplier in the report, which says, just make that point, that Cambodia is very good at creating employment, but it was particularly for the relatively skilled workers in Cambodia. And there the question is, again, is about how can the local population benefit and contribute to the success of the garment sector, and building linkages between the zones and the suppliers.
Very good, thank you. Won Hyuk, can I just ask you to focus your attention on green growth? You mentioned it briefly. Is green growth something that brings with it inevitably equality or inequality? Is it a differentiator, or is it does everybody win?
I don't think everybody wins. There's a fallacy of composition aspect to green growth in that some countries, including Korea and Germany, for instance, have emphasized the early movers advantage when a country moves ahead and carves out a market segment that is developing based on new technologies and so on. But not every country can do that, right? So there's that element to that that's often ignored. But what I'd like to emphasize in my response, I mean, that's all I have to say about green growth, but what I'd like to say in response to Dirk Willem's comment about targeted approach and FDI as follows. When you do targeting, you are trying to build some missing links in the value chain, okay? And that missing links have to be carefully identified, but at the same time, I would emphasize that there has to be something like a performance-based reward, positive reinforcement of successful experiments aspect to it. You cannot just say we are just going to build this capability and just devote resources that way. You have to have a fairly good system of screening and performance-based reward and positive reinforcement mechanism if that's going to work. And that, I think, was the case in Germany, in Japan, and Korea. And with respect to loans versus FDI, I think the key issue is local capacity development. If there's a core of maybe government-linked companies in Singapore or the chaebol in Korea or large companies in China, for instance, it doesn't matter so much whether you rely on loans as opposed to FDI. The key thing is there has to be some domestic anchor that builds its own capability and adds domestic value. And I think that's what's missing in many developing countries. And one last comment to the question about the domination of the financial sector is that if you look at the United States, SNL crisis in the 1980s led to the arrest of Charles Keating and very prominent finance guys. But compare that with what has happened since 2008, 2009. And I don't think it's very useful to have the financial sector dominate the national economy. And this financial sector guy is actually complicating the logistics chain. I mean, in any other industry, we think it's a good idea to remove the middlemen. But in the financial sector, as Hyun Sung-shin emphasized over and over again, they seem to insist on adding more middlemen in the chain, and I don't think that's a good approach. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm just going to ask one question that's come in from our audience online, and then I'm going to ask our three panelists to answer it and any closing words so that we can be in time. There's never time in these events for enough conversation, which is why those of you who are able to stay are welcome to do so for a sandwich and a cup of tea or coffee with our speakers. So please pursue individual conversations with them. I have a question here from Leo. He's part of the Growth and Resilience Department in DFID's Policy Division in Scotland and East Kilbride. And his question is, in increasingly globalised and competitive markets, what practical and non-distortionary measures can national governments take to ensure a shift to more employment-rich growth? That they sit in a global economy. What can they do? Who'd like to start with that one? Joe, do you want to start with that one?
Sure.
So we're just looking for the simple thing, practical and non-discretionary measures governments can take to ensure a shift to more employment-rich growth.
Well, I think in some ways there are some elements that need to be in place regardless, and like developing the human capital is something that is not going to be distortionary in terms of the country vis-a-vis global markets, and also developing the internal infrastructure that is needed in order to address some of the internal disparities, ensuring that the lagging regions get behind. So in some ways it's good to answer first because I can pick the low-hanging fruit. But there are other areas where I think we need to look at some of the distortions that have already been put into place in order to, say, promote globalization. Here I'm thinking of some of the export promotion incentives that have been put in place, and to what extent those have led to outcomes which have been more favorable for capital and for poor. So there may also be these other areas where taking away some past distortions may give us some boost in terms of equality.
Thank you.
I mean, at a very basic level, of course, a lot of non-distortion measures could be done. So it's making markets work. We're talking about labor markets, we're talking about capital markets, and we're also talking about markets like for energy and so on, and removing all the distortions there, I think, is going to be important. Getting the investment climate in order, so the administrative procedures right, and so on. But I think that's not enough. And yes, Hong Kong didn't do anything targeted and so on, but it is very much an exception. And that the evidence is that the richer countries have targeted and are thinking about how to to solve market failures and to solve coordination failures amongst, say, technology and education. And I think that's where we need to be thinking about what sort of market-friendly targeted approaches can be put in place. And there are examples there where that can be put in place, thinking about making FDI work, having targeted skill development, targeted infrastructure, and so on. And there are examples where it has worked. So I think that, yes, half the story is making markets work, but the other half of the story is definitely going beyond that. And there are recent books by Justin Lin, by Joseph Stiglitz, I think, that do emphasize useful policies and institutions that can be put in place to think about solving these market coordination failures.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, if you're a developing country with a comparative advantage in labor-intensive manufacturing, then it's fairly simple to, come up with a non-distortionary policy to create employment-rich opportunities. But when you moved on, and as I showed you in my presentation, when the value-added share of manufacturing diverges from the employment share of manufacturing, then that's a much more difficult problem. And I don't think there are many non-distortionary but employment-rich policies you can adopt. And in Korea, there's a big debate as to how much we should now try to create jobs in social services like childcare, healthcare, and so on, that are very, very sort of custom-made, non-standardized, and so on. But in order to support the growth of this sector, money has to come from somewhere, and that's linked to the question of taxation. So there's a huge debate on that.
Very good. Well, thank you all very much indeed. Thank you also to those watching online. Thank you, Leo, for your question. I hope you felt that was answered reasonably. I now need to bring this session to a close. As I've said, those of you who can stay, please do. In the kitchen immediately behind this room, you're welcome to a sandwich and a drink and a conversation. I don't know how many of you saw in today's Guardian newspaper a comment on the report, and the final paragraph of which says, "The West has learned the hard way in the past 5 years that unleashing a super-rich elite and hoping that they'll drag the rest of the economy behind them doesn't work. As they continue to develop, the Asian nations have a chance to show there is a better way." I'm sure this report will help with that conversation. Thanks very much indeed.